So it's been 3 years now since I changed the motor and converted my 1979 John Deere 210. It used to have an 11 horsepower Kohler motor. I converted it to one of those Jiang Dong Chinese clone motors of a Honda motor. So this is an update on any troubles I had with it over the 3 years. Actually, I'm pretty satisfied with it, but a few things. Well, first thing that went wrong after less than a year is the cogs that come out and grab the starting cup weren't getting enough friction on the thing they ride on, so they were slipping, and you just yank the thing and all of a sudden just about rip your elbow out. So that was a simple fix. Take it apart, adjust things in there, and they got more friction, so then they come out every time you pull. It wasn't until this year, 3 years later, that the string finally broke. They do have poor quality string. The thing with Chinese stuff that they clone is it looks like the real thing, you know, it looks like a motorcycle, it looks like an engine. It actually runs and works or whatever when you buy it. But everything's made thinner and cheaper or of poor quality materials. When you're supposed to have gaskets or tubes or whatever made out of neoprene, they're not. They're made out of rubber, so they dissolve or fall apart and crack. Cords aren't made out of nylon, like pull ropes and stuff. They're just made out of cheap whatever, cotton, and they don't last long. The metal on the casing and tank and frames on motorcycles is just so thin, and it's not carbon steel or doesn't have any molybdenum or strong additives to it, so they just bend or crack. You know, they just look like the real thing, but they're just made out of the lowest quality materials, and they're designed well usually, but if they just use a little bit better quality materials, the Japanese companies would have some competition. So on that subject, the rocker cover gasket started leaking a lot, and well, it was just a rubber or neoprene seal. So I just went to a Honda dealer and bought the right part, and it works perfect and doesn't leak at all now. This little venting tube was collapsing and falling apart for the PCV gases, so that's a Honda tube now, and it's fine. The gasket under here all fell apart and cracked, so I bought a Honda gasket. Well, it used to have a little window in there with a little fuel gauge on it. Well, that plastic only worked with gas for about a couple months, and then it became so cloudy you couldn't see it. Then it formed cracks and started leaking, and then one day just vibration knocked it out. So I just welded it up. On the third year, the on-off switch just disintegrated and fell apart just by vibration. Every year it needs its two rocker arms adjusted, or they start rattling loud. If you don't adjust them, eventually the little push rods pop off. Then it stops running. Amazingly, it doesn't burn any oil, and it gets a lot of use, cutting my 5 kilometers of trails and the 1 acre of land around my building. So I can't complain. The engine seems so far, the engine part anyways, as good as a Honda. It did take almost 4 hours to make it fit something that a Kohler used to fit. The only thing that was exactly the same was all these bolt holes to hold on all this contraption for the belt mechanism. I did have to add spacers. It burns half the fuel as the 11 horsepower cast iron block Kohler. You know, like I said, it always starts in one pull. The Kohler didn't very often. It weighs half as much as than that old cast iron boat anchor. And, well, it's a lot smoother running, a lot less vibration, so less fatigue when you're cutting grass. Now, the most problems I had is with the carburetor. First thing is the little filter mesh in the bottom of the gas tank where the fuel line comes out allows fine pieces of dirt and grass to come through. They get stuck in the needle and seat, and sometimes when you park it, it just overflows the carb if you don't shut the gas valve off, and fills up your crankcase with gas. And if you took off and didn't know that, well, then you got gas mixed with your oil, and you could fry your motor. So a couple times I noticed, and I had to change the oil and blow the dirt out of the needle and seat. Back to poor quality materials. In the carb mold, like a Honda, it's got a solid plastic, well, not a solid, it's got a plastic float. Well, the plastic float distorts and changes over time, and after the first year and a half, the thing would drive for about 10 minutes and then just run out of gas every time, let it sit a couple minutes, and it would fire right up again. It took me a long time to figure out what was causing it. I thought it was restriction in the fuel line, or grass or dirt getting caught in the little nipple where it goes into the carb. But it turned out distortion in the float. And it wasn't allowing the float to fall down all the way. The little stopper thing that lets it fall down as far as it's supposed to fall down, it's just a little piece of plastic, and it just bends the wrong way and stops it from falling down far enough to let fuel in fast enough as it's burning it. So with a pair of side cutters, I cut some of that little dead stop off, and the float would fall back down to its normal level that it falls with no fuel, and that fixed that problem. Like I said, it doesn't burn oil, it doesn't leak oil either, so I'm quite happy. I only change the oil once a year, and she's putting out good. A similar Honda motor, which is a 13 horse, costs about $1,100 in Canada, sometimes $1,200. Well, I know the guy who wholesales these to different places, including Princess Auto in Canada, and I paid $270 including taxes. Well, that's Canadian. Things in the States are cheaper, but that's a great deal. So for the money I paid, I guess I can't complain. It's the best thing I ever did for that mower. I remember paying $500 10 years ago to have my Kohler rebuilt, and that's just getting it re-sleeved and the crank reground and connecting rod and piston and rings and gasket set and valves ground and all that stuff, and I put it together myself. So for something that costs a lot less and seems to be better in every way, well, except for quality of materials, I'm happy. Well, that switch fell apart, so that's my on-off switch now. The only modification I recommend is just putting a little inline filter in that fuel line if you're using it for purposes like me where there's grass and dirt getting into the engine, so you don't get those fuel leaks which could possibly kill your motor because it fills up your crankcase. And of course replace all the rubber parts that are gaskets with Honda rubber parts or neoprene parts. The only mods I've ever made to my tractor, other than keeping it topless because I like the look of it better without the hood on, is cutting out the front of the deck with a torch and then having to reinforce it with angle iron to support itself. That makes it really good at cutting really deep grass. Seems crazy to take a perfectly good tech and just cut out the front, but it doesn't bend the grass and weeds over. They stand up pretty good before they get chopped, so it's very effective. And since I'm not running a hood on it, I had to weld this washing machine back on there to prevent the grass that's flying out, that's flying all over the place now without the front of the deck on, from getting sucked into the pole starter area. She definitely is a sweet oneer and a one-pole wonder. I always cut my grass at full speed because that makes better cutting, more efficient, and less hacking of the grass, spits it out better too. So that's the best way to cut grass, is about 3,500 RPM.